you feeling, man?
Good, dude. Good to be back home. I've been kind of on the road for a little.
Where's home for you?
Right now it's Los Angeles.
I used to live in San Diego for a long time, and so I was up in LA like once a week for many
cool.
years.
Where in San Diego?
I was in Hillcrest, so like a couple miles north of downtown.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was
I'm about
cool,
to be
man.
in San Diego this weekend.
Oh, nice, man. I wish I was still out there. I'm in DC these days.
Oh, I went to high school around there, actually.
Oh, did you?
So we swapped places.
Oh, that's funny. Wait, where'd you? So you went to high school around here? Because you must have bounced around a lot, which I also did. But because you were also in the Bay Area for a while, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where I grew up, along with Hong Kong. And then for high school, I was in Alexandria, so in Northern Virginia.
What's your impression of Alexandria? Because I live in the city proper, and so I'm only going out there if it's like a specific destination. It seems like a totally different world than DC, even though it's so close.
It's completely different. Yeah, I would put Nova in a totally separate category. I would always be oddly relieved going into DC. I say oddly for like.
No, I kind of know what you mean.
I mean, it's. I like the history of like Alexandria. Like it's a nice little like. This is America, like at its core and like its first steps. You know what I mean? It's like when you go to the first steps, like place in Elden Ring.
That's so funny. Yeah, it's like you can kind of see. You're like, oh, I see where all this came from. It's for better or for worse. I kind of get that. Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. I love the idea too. I relate strongly to the idea of being relieved going into the big city. Because I think a lot of people would imagine that to be like the stressful place. It's more hectic, all that. But I don't know if you feel the same, but I've always been the guy who, you get into a big city and it's like, finally.
Yeah. Same. Definitely same. I was just like 6 years old already taking like, I don't know, public transport to get to school. And it's just like, I'm so used to navigating a city, but you take me out of that and I'm a little more lost, you know?
Yeah. I will say as I've gotten older, I very much appreciate a quieter moment, and I could totally see myself needing more time in remote places than I used to. But I still don't know that I would ever be like the old man who moves out to the field somewhere, you know?
Yeah, I think I envisioned that and I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds so nice. And then that actually like starts to happen and I'm like, wait, I'm really bored.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think moving around a lot helps too. Because then, I don't know. I think I just get itchy if I'm in any scenario for too long.
Yeah. I agree. I'm starting to feel that soon too.
Yeah. What would be the next spot after LA?
I mean, I've always wanted to live in New York, like before I get decrepit, you know?
Yeah.
I'm like, if I don't live there now, I don't think I could ever live there. So my sister's out there. I think I've always just like had wanderlust to head towards that area. Like it's not wanderlust if I'm going in one area, but.
So wait, where were you actually born?
I was born in Hong Kong.
Okay. And then you moved to the States pretty quickly after that?
Yeah, well, I kind of split my time. So by the time I was like 4, I would say, I started coming to the States a lot. And then when SARS hit, I fully came to San Francisco and was there for, I think, 1.5 or 2 years. And then it was back to like being back and forth until high school.
Okay, I got you. Mm-hmm. So then, I mean, maybe just even from a young age, then you like, it's not even wanderlust at that age. It's just like, oh, this is normal to go back and forth and to move around a lot.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I didn't even think of it as like abnormal. I was just like, oh, this is my reality.
Yeah, this is just how life works.
It was cool though. I think having San Francisco and Hong Kong as two of my like main cultural like bastions was like interesting as far as like, I don't know, my taste in aesthetics and like what I find to be home, you know?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, maybe we can talk about music through that lens too, because I'd be curious your impressions of like what you would hear just sort of ambiently around you in Hong Kong when you were little. And then I think about San Francisco as well, especially for electronic music, has a really interesting and deep history. But then I think in like the modern era, it maybe gets overlooked a bit as far as, you know, the EDM scene, if we want to call it that, despite the fact that it has such a big community for it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like, okay, so I would say my foray into like rave, or like not even rave, but just like electronic music in general, in San Francisco is a little later in life. Like I definitely participated, but I was more so just skating and like listening to like boom bap than I was like listening to anything electronic when I was in San Francisco. But in Hong Kong, it was like, we didn't even know it was EDM. You know what I mean? We didn't even know it was like, it was just like, oh, this guy like is going to DJ at this club called XXX. And like, it's a bunch of 14, 15-year-olds just like raving to drum and bass. And we didn't even know it was drum and bass. You know what I mean? It was just like the default. Like at that point, there wasn't like EDM in its current form. Like now there's like this huge umbrella, and like, it's all like, all the subgenres are like subsidiaries of this big EDM umbrella company, sort of, it feels like. But back then, especially in Hong Kong, like there, it wasn't even big enough to like have a non-underground. So it was like jungle, like breakbeat stuff, like everything sounded like the Prodigy-esque.
Yeah.
I think it was also like fitting for the environment we're in.
Wait, what do you mean?
Oh, just like, I think the aesthetic of Hong Kong is like very grungy and very punk, and like, it's always been like that, where like kids were like decked out in piercings and like tatted up, and like, it was just very like, you know, cyberpunk. And I feel like jungle and acid and breakbeat, stuff like that, it all kind of feeds into each other. I mean, they still throw these raves. I was there like a couple years ago, and this local girl took me, I guess not local girl, I am local, but she has a more, you know, better idea of the lay of the land than I do, at least. Yeah. And she took me to this like fishing, like industrial fishing building. And these fishermen would basically just like throw these, like, they live in like a communal apartment essentially. And they just like bring in a big system and fucking pack it out. And it's just like an actual rave on like the 47th floor of some random fishing building.
Sounds kind of like awesome.
Blasting jungle. Yeah, no, it was really cool. It was definitely a very interesting aesthetic too. Because you'd expect, like, I don't know, being in America for so long, you'd almost expect that kind of music to like be tied to like, you know, a bunch of wooks and like white dreads. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's some things wrong with that, but, but I don't think they're inherently like, you know, malicious. But yes. I mean, there's something comforting like going to a rave and seeing a bunch of people who like dress and look like me, or like have similar.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I don't even think you need to qualify that. That just, of
course. Yeah. I was like, damn, this is a really, really dope vibe.
And I was always curious, not to interrupt, but like always curious about the scene in Hong Kong, especially the underground scene. I've never been to Hong Kong. And so, you know, when I was younger, I didn't hear about it in conjunction with electronic music really much at all, you know, save a few artists who like were coming out, like broke out to tour the US. But then even later on, like during when EDM had like the big explosion and a lot of American EDM guys started going to Hong Kong and just China broadly to tour. And all the reports back were kind of like, yeah, this feels new. Like it feels like this wasn't here before, but I have a hard time believing that. And I don't know. I've just always been curious about like the underground. Where did parties happen? Like what was the local scene like? It's really interesting to hear about that. Like I think 47th floor party.
Totally, yeah. I think culturally, there's a huge difference in that. I would say people in Hong Kong are pretty open. Like when they want to go to see music or listen to music, not see, they're just thinking about the vibe. So I feel like different clubs in Hong Kong, like there's this club called OMA, there's this club called Social Club. They tend towards techno and like a certain vibe. Maybe Omo will have like drum and bass nights, you know what I mean? But largely it's just like, it's not like, oh, this DJ is coming into town. It's just like, oh, it's a techno night and there's like 5 or 6 techno DJs in this lineup. So it adopts more of like, I don't think ticket sales work the same way, where here it's like, oh, we're not going to go to the event at all unless it's a DJ we know and like. Like generally speaking, if you go out to, I don't know, let's say Alex Perez plays a show in LA, everyone going to the show is probably an Alex Perez somewhat fan, if not like fan, or they've heard of Alex Perez and someone's like, hey, you should really check this guy out. In Hong Kong, it's like, even if Alex Perez were to play like a sick party, I would say like 20% of the people going are going to be like diehard Alex Perez fans, but everyone else is just like sick, good drum and bass. Like, let's get it going, you know? So I think sometimes that gets conflated with like people being like, oh, they've never heard this kind of music before, which I think maybe in other parts in China could be true. But in a place like Hong Kong, it's like, no, they just like are hyped to be there and they're excited to listen to the music. And largely speaking, yeah, maybe if you're bringing your sounds from, I don't know, Hamburg, Germany, like they might be a little unaware, but largely genre wise, I think they're actually quite tapped in.
That almost is a better way of thinking in my mind, to just go out because you like the music and you're excited to hear maybe something you haven't heard before, not necessarily having to know every song by every producer. Like, that's, I think, one of the big problems that I have with the current dance music scene is that it's turned so much into like rock stardom and hero worship. And, not that it's tough because I want everyone to succeed. And like, if you succeed enough, that's just what happens. But it is one of those.
It doesn't have to be that way, though. You're correct. I don't think it has to be that way at all. Like, I think there is a noticeable shift in the way, it's just a noticeable shift in the way that we perceive DJs, like in the way we perceive the music that's coming out. Like, I think part of it is also the loss of mysticism behind like DJing and whatnot now, where it's like now everyone is kind of that. So it creates this hyper competitive market almost, where people are like, oh, I need people to know that I'm worthy of like perceiving. So what do I have to do to do that? You know, it's like these rock star moments we're talking about, or like, yeah, I mean, it's just a huge cultural difference. I think a lot of Asian countries in general, when it comes to electronic music, they're a little less like that. But at the same time, you can't even, like, if we look at K-pop or like even some of these like Chinese folk singers, like the way they're perceived, it's like beyond rock startup. It's like crazy.
Oh,
know?
yeah.
Like,
I mean, if you want to talk about like who's got the lock on crazy fandom, it's got to be Asia, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard to say that, that exists as like, I don't know. People will point to like, I don't know, hyper individualism in the West for like why that is a thing. But I really think it's just human nature to kind of like elevate, and then people put you on a pedestal. I think that's very like within human nature. But I do think that it's saturation of like electronic music that like gives it, the edge we're talking about, where it's like, I don't know. I don't want to say influencery, but no, totally definitely in that vein,
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone's dealing with it in one way or another. I mean, just doing this podcast, it's like half the conversations these days are, people stating how they feel about the current social media landscape.
It's honestly insanity.
Bad,
It's hilarious. It's like everyone is so like not down with it, but then we all partake and like conform to this like algorithm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, my bleak view on it that I think about from time to time. I mean, it's really just like, it's all of us artists like performing capitalism. You know what I mean? Like it's like conforming to the algorithm really is just like, this is the way the company would like you to make them money. Like that's really what it is.
We fully just decided to monetize attention in a vacuum, which on paper sounds okay. It doesn't seem, that evil, But when you,
well, sure,
when you get
and
down,
like it brings us money too, right? So like I get why people, there's absolutely no judgment to anyone who really leans into it, because obviously you benefit from it too. But then I don't know, man, it's some cynical part of my brain. It's just like, oh man, the guts of this machine are really
there
dark.
was like a shift, right? Like if you remember the era of the internet where it was like internet forums and like even YouTube was supreme. You know what I mean? Like back then, a YouTube video would get a bunch of downvotes and people wouldn't see it anymore. Like it would go down in viewership because people would be like, oh, this is not good for people to see. But now it's like the more controversial, the more like cringe baity it is, the better it does. Cause then you have like a bunch of people hating on it. And that just like they're like, oh, this is engagement. This is good. People want to see this, whether it's out of rage, or like, you know, they really, really love it.
Well, let me ask you this, because this is all fascinating, and I want to make sure we're actually talking about your music as well and like your experiences here. There was some quote you had in an older interview. And I'm paraphrasing here, so it's not exact, but you were talking about that it bothered you sometimes how few opportunities there were for more experimental music to get platformed in like the larger EDM space. And why I thought of that from what we were just talking about is I feel like the experimental scene is, I think at heart, an internet scene. It is like an online scene. And I had never really thought about this before, but I was like, does that also mean that it sometimes suffers from that lack of human element? Like, is it more susceptible to what you were just talking about as far as like, you know, being able to be manipulated by algorithms, I don't know, more easily disregarded because there isn't like the physical community for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it's in the name in a way. Like when something's experimental, it's inherently like nerdier because it's like you're going above and beyond technically like what most humans would consider like palatable. Because like in general with music and art, right? It's like you get to a certain point and it's like, okay, this is commercially viable. Being experimental or being forward thinking, supposedly at least, is about like kind of destroying that and being like, let's take it one step further. So inherently you're making your fan base smaller and B, appealing to a very specific demographic of people who are like total dorks about this stuff. So it means like people who actually produce or people who've like just been listening to this kind of music forever to the point where they're slightly fried, you know, and then they're like, oh yeah, we like this, or they're spun out. So it's like,
well, I will say, I think there's at least one more group for that, because I think it's always the experimental scenes that trickle down to the mainstream. Yeah. It's always where the boundaries get broken, something new and cool and fresh happens. And so I think another group is just the people who like being on that cutting edge or like seeing what's coming next. And, you know, have some tolerance for that experimentation.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I feel like I'm actually, you know, even though I fall under that umbrella of experimental, and I think a lot of my earlier stuff is, a lot of my stuff now is like trying to handhold people from like more of the center into the left field.
That's so fun. That's a really interesting observation, which makes total sense that, you know, especially now that you are, you know, integrating more into the scene, getting more attention, more stuff going on for your career. Of course, the bigger acts are going to start noticing. And that's also a very funny thing that I've noticed many times over the years is like you talk to some of these really big mainstream acts and oftentimes they're desperate to like get out of it, to try something else. Yeah. They see what some, you know, experimental person is doing. They're just like, oh, it looks so fun. You know?
Yeah. You're like less poisoned, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it's always like an ongoing battle between, you know, what the average raver wants, what your average fan wants, and then what you want. And what maybe you and your peers want, because usually that's kind of tied together, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And it's just like this ongoing balancing act. of like trying to exist.
Well, yeah, and to try to like pay your rent, and it's like there are considerations. And to be clear, I'm realizing too, I should say for anybody listening who is less familiar with your work, I don't think it's actually fair to cast you as just like an experimental producer. I mean, I play a lot of your songs out. I have for many years. They're dance floor bangers. I think you actually, it's one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you. It's like, I feel like you have figured out how to really straddle both worlds in an interesting way. And I don't know if that's an intentional thing you figured out over time, or if that's kind of just naturally where you land.
It's definitely intentional. I think I've always been inspired largely like by the dance floor for sure. Like, but I think when I started producing, I got so lost in like, the fact that this could exist, like if I put 20 delays and like slam the feedback, what's going to happen? You know what I mean?
Right.
And I kind of got lost in that like sound design vomit land for a little bit. But then the more time I've spent DJing and just like being around dance floors, I'm like, there's something really cool about like everyone locking in at like, right now my obsession is 140 again, but it tends to like ping pong between that and like 170-ish, as well as the slower stuff, like 130, 120-ish. But yeah, there's something really addictive about like organizing sounds in a way that, I mean, doesn't get people to headbang, you know what I mean? Because it's just like trying to tear someone's face off, but like getting them into like groove that I find like very interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, to be honest, I get bummed out when I see people starting to headbang. Like that's just not, it was never, there's nothing wrong with it, but it was never what I did when I was a kid getting into this. And it's also never what I'm intending to happen when I make music,
Yeah.
So like, I'm appreciative of any response, but yeah, I'm with you there, man. I mean, I kind
of love it when they try to headbang and I'm like playing like double time 140 and
right. It's like the little bobblehead doll. Like,
yeah. But they're like off because they're like, they try to do it once and then it just throws them off the groove completely and they're just thrashing.
Well, man, on the new EP, the Monomyth EP, I also really, really liked that opener, the house tune, Soul Ties. That's something I had heard you do less of, and man, I feel I would love to hear you do more of that too, because I love that tune.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I actually make quite a bit of stuff in that vein, but I've always been nervous about like just fully opening. I mean, I feel like the Saka project has slowly just become more and more things. Like initially it was like heavier melodic halftime and it became drum and bass-ish halftime. And then I was making 140 and I was always nervous to bridge another gap and be like, okay, I'm making garage / baseline now. Yeah. That song's like 135, almost 140. But I think honestly, at this point, I've cultivated a pretty open, like the fact that you even know my music, like you're probably the exact type of person I generally make music for, where it's like, you're very astutely like aware of all of the different kinds of genres and like offerings that electronic music might have. And you're down to like explore. And like, I feel like I've cultivated enough people who think similarly that, I can release a song like that and have it do like pretty well still.
Oh, absolutely. Well, hey, thanks for the compliment there. But yeah, I think a lot of that just comes down to the fact that I've been doing this for too long. I've seen a lot of this, but no, man. Yeah. I mean, I love all that kind of stuff because I'm very much a weirdo at heart and like the weirder experimental stuff. I mean, especially when I was younger, I was huge into like the breakcore scene, like Venetian snares and Pangea and all that kind of stuff. Like that's very close to my heart. So like for me, it's almost harder for me to connect with like the mainstream, like poppier side of dance music than it is for the weirder side.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's like a bifurcation.
Yeah. You get it.
There's a bifurcation for sure where I feel like, and that's kind of why I want to throw bass music more in the other category, even though I feel like as of late, it's really hitting this left field bass, or experimental bass is really reaching like a very mainstream level of success right now. But I think it's not really included in the other side of tendencies, right? So I think there's like the acts that sell out arenas here, but globally maybe wouldn't, have the same effect.
Yeah.
And then acts like, let's say Ross from Friends, or like Fortet, or like even Skrillex, where they have like a global appeal because they kind of fit into, it's kind of like what acts Boiler Room are willing to book. You'll kind of have an idea of like that side of electronic music. And then there's like the EDM Insomniacs of the world, right? Where it's like a little more, I don't even want to say dance floor oriented, because that's not the right. It's like, it's so ready for young raver consumption, where it's like, it does all the things so that the kids know it's time to put your hands up and 3, 2, 1 jump. But largely speaking, a lot of bass music hasn't been like that until relatively recently, where it's like starting to bleed into like the bro step side of stuff.
Yeah. You know what?
Yeah.
You just made me think of this too, is I think there's also something to just how big the audience has gotten. And so also how big the like events and festivals have gotten, that I think for an artist, if you're playing on some mega stage at a festival in front of 20,000 people, it playing like kind of entry level, bass house banger with build up and drop, like that's a very easy thing to understand in a giant space like that. And I wonder if that's part of it too, is it's like, how do we make more interesting experimental kind of stuff work on a giant stage as these stages get bigger and bigger? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it has to be like a G Jones, where it's like, you have to like, this is kind of the realization I had when I didn't shift my sound fully, but just started taking on more dance floor tendencies. I kind of just accepted the fact that like, especially on massive systems and bigger crowds like that, you kind of have to handhold them in some way or fashion to get them to get to the place that you want them to go to. So it's not actually that like bad to do, in my opinion. Like some people will be like, oh, like that's so like that makes your art inherently apologetic or whatever. But I think that's actually one of the cool, like for me at least, it's something to aspire for, because not only are you getting to, please the people that are there for, the Willy Joys of the crowd, where they're there for the breakcore, they're there for the moments that are more artful, but you also get to like bring people into the fold who otherwise would have no idea. Like their only other artists they've seen are like Millennium or Slander, which is a very specific type of electronic music, right? With all of the tendencies that we're talking about, where, our younger ravers would immediately hear and be like, wow, this is amazing. And I feel really good hearing this. But it's like kind of combining the two, which is actually what I appreciate watching, even like so many Slander sets, like being on tour with them. They actually will play like Sinkhole by Noisia, or like play a Mephius tune. And it works. Like these kids go crazy. And it's because they've provided the context for them to start understanding more complex stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's also the part of it is just like, you gotta let some ego go as well, because it's like the whole point of this is the community. Like the whole point of DJing, it's not so you can show how cool your taste is. It's like, so you can, connect with a room of people and you sort of facilitate everybody having a good time. Like, that's if you really break it down, that's what it is. And so the idea of like, whether it's through some production choice or through some, whatever, more mainstream song or a cappella you throw in an edit or whatever it is that brings more people in, that's just like a nice, friendly thing to do. It's like, it's just welcoming more people in. And of course, you don't want to go so far that you sort of compromise your integrity or, you know, what you have to say or your perspective or all that. But like the divide between those two, there's so much space in between there.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting ways to do it.
And there are, I think there are still gigs that sometimes are just like unsalvageable. Like you get up there and they just like hate everything you're doing. And it's like, okay, well, I'll have fun. But most of them are, most of them are salvageable. I think most of them, you know, I don't know. It's kind of like even seeing some of my peers, there's something very underrated about like taking a hip hop classic that everyone loves and just like making it left field bass, you know?
Yeah.
Everyone's just like, okay, this is the one that makes me like it.
That's cool. I didn't actually realize you had done a bunch of touring with Slander. How'd you link up with them?
They hit me up, I think 2021, for music basically. And one of my first, like, I don't want to say viral, but first songs that were like, they were played out and like people really supported the release. It was Shaolin, and that was on their label. And so after that, you know, it was like a bunch of RL Grime played it, and obviously Slander played it. It was on their label. Zed played it. Skrillex played at one point, and it just like led to my project getting a lot more buzz, because I don't think I was really, you know, on the socials as much as some people have been, I guess. So I didn't really capitalize in that moment as well in certain ways, but it led to me being booked on a lot of tours, just like having a lot more gigs. And a lot of them were with them. Yeah.
But yeah, that's cool, man. I like those guys a lot. And this sort of goes back to something we were saying earlier too, is a lot of times when those bigger acts that I think get known for a certain sound and their fans get like obsessed and like laser focused on this one sound, 100 times out of 100 times, the actual artist, again, is like, has such broad interests, listening to everything. And it's kind of just like, well, they found the thing that worked for this project. But yeah, it's just interesting once you get on the other side of it, because it really is. I think they're even more excited to support other stuff, you know? Oh, yeah.
I think you're very, I think calling it laser focused in terms of what you have to be is such a good, because that's what kind of has to happen. I think in certain ways I've grown less quickly because I've purposefully sort of just made so many different kinds of music.
I think that's like valid too, though. I will say, like, I don't know. I have to assume that, like, you know, like a Mr. Carmack would be, you know, another like inspirational path to someone making music like you, where it's like, I think both choices are valid, where it's like, if you establish that, like, no, I make everything and this is really more about like following the interest at hand, whatever that may be, I think that's totally valid too. But I do hear what you're saying about, like,
yeah, I mean, you just have to do the flip. You know what I mean? Like Carmack works because he makes like such a high volume of work that within that volume, he's going to do the flip that everyone's kind of looking for. Like, I think that's no matter what, there is an element, especially in electronic music, to where it's like, okay, when are you going to do the flip? Like, with G Jones, it was like in your head. You can kind of clearly hear when he's going like dance floor mode and when he's like not, you know?
Yeah.
It's just a very cool opportunity to get people, to bring people into the fold.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was wondering when you were saying that, because I don't know G Jones, but I was like, I wonder how intentional it is when he does that. Like, I wonder if he's like, okay, now I need to make the flip, like you were saying. You know, it's like, it's been a while.
Yeah.
Let's give him one. I wonder, because some people are like that, you know, in terms of like strategy, and then other people, you would think they'd be like that, and they're just off in another.
Well, I'm
universe.
not sure if it's. I know. I just think that when you get to a certain level of production, like, it almost has to be intentional. Like, you kind of know. Like, I definitely know when I'm like being extra dance floor like vibes, and when I'm kind of not. Like, I'm rarely, at this point in my career, I'm rarely surprised when people like a track and when they don't like a track. Like, for example, with Soul Ties, I know that my friends who don't really listen to electronic music are going to hear that song and be like, oh, wait, I actually like this one, dude. And then my friends, who are like in bass music, they listen to it and they're like, oh, this is cool. Like, whatever.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, for this whole EP, the Monomyth EP, did it feel like a different experience making it than other releases you've done? Like, were you thinking more in these terms?
I think it was more of a return to my original. So the very first time I wrote an EP, I kind of did a similar thing where I storyboarded it all out. And then I had like an idea, like timeline wise, how all the sonics would kind of fit together. And I do wish it was more seamless, because some of the transitions I think are less seamless than I would have liked, on like in retrospect. But I do think it is all still chronological in order, which not in terms of when I wrote it, but just like the way that it all fits together. Whereas I think some of my other EPs have been an assortment of tracks that the label liked and I liked, and we're just like, okay, this is a cool, we'll come together and just say, you know, this order of tracks makes sense. But this was definitely more intentional in like following some sort of journey I had built in my head. And yeah, Soul Ties being like where everything starts off. And I think of it as like a death and rebirth of like our protagonist. And then Ghoul is kind of like them coming back to life, find themselves again. And that's what I kind of want to do sonically too, was like Soul Ties being a rebirth or death, something that's totally outside of my realm. And then Ghoul being like kind of on the nose as far as like what I think my fans are ready for and like from me.
Yeah.
And then Shenlong and Nifrit also kind of both in that realm where they're these two demons that are protagonists, like slays from lore. And then Ichiban is just like all ego, obviously in the name. It's like, I'm the best, and it drops into song.
Was it the kind of thing where you had the concept and then kind of tried to soundtrack that idea?
Yeah, totally. So it wasn't like, I think my other EPs have been me writing, like even Silk, which I was really stoked on. That was like my own self-release that I put out. But that was like a collection of just like emotions that I had felt and like songs that I had made over a period of time without any intention of being like, okay, these songs are all going to like be together. It was just like, I feel this type of way, I'm going to make a song. For pretty much all the music on Monomyth, I think only Soul Ties is the one where I was just like, oh, I'm feeling melancholy, I'm going to write a tune about feeling that way. Everything else was definitely more of like I'm imagining this sick white dragon that you have to defeat. I'm going to soundtrack it out in bass music format.
I like that, man. I think that's an underappreciated way to create. I mean, I'm also a huge nerd, so I relate to that.
I was going to say, it's very nerdy inherently, which...
Yeah, but I think it's good, man. Well, you know, if we take like the bigger view of it, you know, soundtracking a movie, like that's all the movies we love, all the moments, the iconic images, you know, it's all enhanced by the soundtrack that's running underneath it. Like that's not like a fringe idea, you know, like
definitely not. Yeah,
that underpins like huge parts of our culture. So to me, it makes total sense to create that way, and also probably makes it more fun than just like sitting down in front of the blank DAW day after day.
Yeah, 100%. It made things fun and also like easier in certain ways because I knew like what I had to kind of do. Whereas sometimes just sitting there being like, oh, I need to write an EP. It just seems so much more of a daunting task versus being like, oh, I have to make the Dragons song today.
Right. Yeah, well, it's fun. It's getting back to play also, which is, I talk about that all the time on air, but like that's part of it too, is like you have to keep reinventing and finding new ways to like just make it feel like play again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I need that, definitely.
Yeah,
right now.
Dude, it's tough. It's tough. I don't know. I mean, because you've been doing this for a while at this point. Like, what is like the driver? What is the exciting part to you right now?
I think it has to be project by project. Like, I think that's what keeps me enthused. So I kind of, if I like think too hard about it, then I start to hate the idea of touring. but largely speaking, I think it all just like ties in together really well. I just have to like find time for myself to keep evolving. And then I'm like pretty stoked. But I think as long as I think about my project as having like chapters of Sonics, then I don't get as like existential about everything. I'm like, okay, I have, the next 6 months kind of planned out as far as like what I need to do sonically to like accomplish my goals. And so I'm in that next phase now. It's like every time I release a big project, I'm like, okay, time to move on. Like,
is that exciting? Is that stressful to feel like, okay, like I finished this big thing I'm working on and immediately I have to start this next phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? I think it's good because I think being busy is just like good in this climate.
Yeah, I agree.
But simultaneously, it's definitely stressful. But I think inherently as a person, you just kind of have to be like down for that to be like a career producer. Because I think in terms of raw talent or like even like production chops, whatever it is, like it's not like touring artists who are just like unequivocally like the best at it. I think it's more about just being like down with that kind of level of output.
Yeah.
Which means you just have to be somewhat okay with feeling pretty uncomfortable and stressed out. Like with like a big with like a big cathartic payoff at some point, right? So it's like I think I've trained my brain over the years, just like in all the things I've like randomly like started to like in my life. Like when I was really young, it was like b-boying, and then it was skating, and then it was like certain video games. It's just like a lot of grind for an eventual payoff that feels amazing, but it like takes so long to get that point. I would say music production is very much so like in that vein.
Yeah. And I mean, that's it. It's a reflection of a lot of things in life. You're right. I mean, it's the same with like taking care of yourself physically, like working out, eating right. Like none of that shit is that fun in the moment, but then, the results of it are very rewarding. And it's always sort of a constant push-pull. How'd you even get into making music? What was your entry into like, even just like the interest in dance music?
I mean, at first, I think it was I just really got into raving in general.
Where at?
And it was, I think in college when I really like started to kick in. And it was honestly like house music. It was all like house music parties. I got really into Dirty Bird and like all the like local kind of burner-esque scenes I would go to. And back then I was like very into spinning poi.
Oh, nice.
And it was just like I
hanging out with some of those white dreadlocks we were talking about.
Oh, earlier. For sure. Yeah, big time. And yeah, eventually it led to an interest in DJing. I was like, oh, what's happening here? And then when I started DJing, I was like, wait, I'm just pressing play on this stuff. Like I want to make the thing.
Right.
And then, I kind of just like continued from there. Yeah. Did you
have like, I was just asking because, getting into production, it's like a complicated thing. There's a steep learning curve at the start.
Oh yeah.
Did you have aptitude for it? Like, were you always?
No, I was terrible at it. Honestly, all my friends were like, "Oh wait," they were like, "You should do it. You're gonna be really good." And then they were like, "Oh wait, maybe he's not gonna be good." I don't know.
Were you musical at all? Do you like play instruments? Did anyone in your family?
Yeah, and that was the thing that people were all confused about. They were like, "Wait, you've been playing saxophone and singing and playing piano like for so much of your life and you can't really make beats." Like it's confusing. But I just kept pulling teeth and eventually I got to like a good place.
That's fair. I mean, is that all it was? Just like putting in the 10,000 hours?
I mean, I had a lot of so Fly, who's this other producer, both me and him went to school together, and he was the first of our friend group to like really take production seriously. So he definitely, I stand on the shoulders of giants. So he did a lot of the like first heavy lifting, I would say, when it came to like learning stuff. So he'd compiled like a bunch of resources already and like tutorials and stuff that would help. But yeah, a lot of YouTube and like him in the beginning helped me through the first I would say the first like 8-10 months that I was producing, like I was just terrible. I mean, the first time I ever tried to produce was like, I think I was like 18 or 19. And it was so bad that I just didn't open Ableton again for another like 2 years. Yeah. Yeah. Like I made a song that was so bad that I was like, I don't like, cause my taste was kind of there, you know, like I was already DJing. So I kind of knew what a song was supposed to sound like. And like my song didn't. Like I think I put the snare on the 1 and I bounced it out, and then, you know, Fly to see him, he's like, dude, the snare is on the 1. And I was like, it's fine. He's like, no, it's not fine.
Which is funny because you saying that now in my head, I was like, oh, maybe you could do something cool with that. It's funny. Yeah. Like once you know the rules, then it becomes cool to break them. But if you break them without knowing what they are, oftentimes, that's not going to be good.
Yeah.
That's funny.
100%.
And was it kind of like a linear thing once you got into it in terms of like you entering the music industry? Like once you got a taste for it? Okay.
Oh, no. Yeah, definitely not at all. I was still working. Well, I finished school and then went into my first job. And then that was when I got really addicted to producing, because I was living in San Francisco at my mom's, in her basement, honestly.
Nice.
And I would like commute to work. It would take like an hour and a half. And I was just I felt so bored and trapped. It was like right after college, and I didn't really have as many friends back in the Bay Area at the time. And so every day was just like this in total, like 3.5 hour commute to work, and like being in the office from like 9 a.m. till 9 p.m., sometimes midnight, because it was like a startup that I was working for. And I just started to get like, producing was like my only solace. And that's when I feel like I started to get really good, because I was like getting hyped up on stimulants and then just like making music nonstop.
Well, and there's something when you're able to have that be your escape too. I think there's actually as to that, because sure, you're burning the candle at both ends, but then it's like you realize what a gift it is to get to make music opposed to, you know, people who do it professionally, which you're now doing too, where it's like your job.
100%. I would say my output then was honestly like maybe higher than it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, not in terms of like how fast I am now, like, but as far as like sitting in front of the computer, watching a tutorial, you know, going on Patreon and like finding my favorite producer at the time and like trying to like level up and like evolve. I feel like it was just it was a different phase, but also like in terms of raw, like attention on producing, it was like even more. And I was like working a full-time job.
Were you like coding? Like what were you doing? It sounds like it was
I was a UX. Yeah, I was a UX designer. So I was doing like user research and also doing, you know, design stuff. And then at that point too, I realized there's so many like similarities in what I was doing. Like I was like, oh, design is very close to like producing in a lot of ways. I was sitting in Sketch a lot and like Premiere Pro and just whatever I needed to be on. And like, it was always like, whoa, this is like very close to what producing feels like. Because when you're producing music, it's not like a blank canvas, really. It's more of like a template upon which you can change parameters and then build, which is a lot more similar to design than like you looking at a painting or like a canvas and just like starting to paint. I think it's interesting because it's like there is freedom within having limitations on your art. So like I think sometimes it makes the creative process easier when you have a set of tools that you're like already ready to use. Because technically in a blank canvas, like an actual blank canvas, you can do pretty much anything. Like if someone were to be like, okay, go find some sort of paint and put this on here. It doesn't even have to be paint. It could be like foil or whatever medium you choose to work with. And producing is a similar thing, but it really is a set of like parameters that you're fucking with to get the desired effect. So it's like, I think it makes creating more of this, like it's easier to get into flow state almost, in my opinion, when you have these controls. Yeah, I don't know what my point was there.
No. Yeah, I agree with you completely. And it makes sense. The reason I even asked about coding was that it to me, like a coding background almost makes more sense that you would have some aptitude eventually for music production than like a music background in sort of an ironic way. Because so much of it is, it ends up becoming like coding. It ends up becoming like doing math or like even playing video games. Like it's an interesting sort of interdisciplinary kind of thing to do. And it's interesting to hear you talk about design too, because did you used to design clothes as well? I read that somewhere.
Yeah, I did. I did for a little in college. Yeah.
That's it. Was it on like a pro level?
Yeah, I mean, it was like what I was doing immediately after college, and I was kind of juggling that and my job. It was like me and my Asian friend at this one point, like we were the kind of token Asian guys in our friend group. And at one point, like one of our female friends, they're like, "Oh, you guys are just the soft Asian boys." Like, and it became like this like hilarious joke. And well, initially I just printed like 40 shirts a joke and sold them in the cafeteria. And like within 2 minutes, like I sold out completely. And I was like, what is going on? So we just kept making more like merch. And eventually there was some snafu, but yeah, we kicked the can down the road for a little bit.
Did you have any like frame of reference for that? Like designing clothes, obviously there's reflections of what it takes to be good at that in music production and some of the other stuff we've been talking about, but it's also its own beast in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I always think I liked fashion, but this brand wasn't even like, it was very streetwear. So it wasn't the craziest in terms of like, I mean, we had a couple of cut and sew stuff, but largely speaking, it wasn't like, a lot of it was like a glorified, somewhat skate brand because we just had friends that would skate in it. And it was fun for a while, but then there was this whole DACA thing. And like, because of it getting rescinded or whatever, a bunch of the workers at the factory that we were like working with, like bailed and like,
wow.
Like bankrupted the company.
Jesus Christ, dude. That's terrible. Oh man.
Yeah. But it taught me a lot of stuff just like moving forward, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it taught me like how hard it is to like have your own business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you are kind of your own business as we speak now, you know, so I'm sure there's some lessons you can take from that too. Not to mention the fact that I don't know if you, how much of a hand you have in your own merch and all that too, but I'm sure there's a lot you can apply to your current career.
No, absolutely. I was like, oh, we're back again. It's the same thing. Except, you know, a little more tangible. I feel like back then I was always like grasping for like a reason to make my merch. Like I was like, why does this merch exist? I have to find a reason. But now it's like, oh, I just exist. And like this merch is like part of my brand, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Which feels a lot more authentic in certain ways. Like I'm even making merch I like way more now than I ever was.
Yeah, well, because you have parameters again, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. When were you able to quit the job?
So it was so funny. I remember being like, okay, like I'm trying to play more shows. I'm going to quit. You know, it was like 3 weeks before COVID hit. And I was just like, I'm just going to quit now and see what happens. And then 3 weeks later, COVID hits. And I'm like, oh, shit, this was really bad timing.
Oh, man. Rough.
But I kind of made it was kind of like this fork in the road where I was like, okay, I can either like rally and like go back into tech and like keep doing this music stuff on the side for fun. Or I can like really double down, you know, while I'm collecting unemployment and just see where this can go. And hopefully this pandemic ends. And I would say COVID is really when I started to see more traction in my project. Cause I feel like everyone else just kind of, or a lot of touring acts at least, like kind of eased up on the gas pedal. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to do all the streams. I'm going to put out music. I'm going to do the thing. And then after the pandemic didn't end, but after things were back to being open, at least, it was like my first gig started happening, played a like handful of shows at Ivy Lab. And then it was like shortly after that, Slander. And then, got got into Insomniac's good graces. Shout out.
Shout out Insomniac, indeed.
I feel like they always try to do a nod towards the boutique kind of underground. And I was kind of like the go-to suspect for a while.
Yeah, I think about that too. And I've thought about trying to get someone from Insomniac on here, but I don't think we could even have like a really honest conversation in public about it. Like, I want to know the conversation between, again, it's like the mainstream versus underground artist thing we were talking about before, where I'm sure so many of them would like to put on so many weirder acts, but there's only so many slots they can in an operation that big.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and even then it's like events overall, like ticket sales just aren't where they were like right at the beginning of like the pandemic ending. Well, it's not. Yeah. It's not.
Yeah. No, it's not. It's
like right when things opened up again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there was kind of a moment where you could be extra eclectic with your creation choices. And now it's kind of like, okay, we have to have acts on here that'll actually help us not lose money.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are the acts you book that, make the people happy. And then there are the acts you book that make the industry happy. So I always think that like the people in the industry generally have like the most advanced taste. I mean, like that's kind of goes without saying, but like they're a little more aware of like what is actually good electronic music. And it's always like the other two main audience groups, I think, that you kind of need to catch up in certain ways. And they kind of know that too. Like one of my friends, Sahil, this will always stick with me because he was like, so when you go up and play your set, you can do anything you want, right? But like just know that for some acts they book because they literally just need the ticket sales. And for some acts they book because they are just hoping that you are going to teach these young ravers like what's up in a lot of ways. And like, it's kind of bigger than you at that point. Right. Like that's how I've always seen it. Like when I'm even playing this like festival out in China, Greenfields, like every other act was like, it was like the Chainsmokers, Rehab, and then like my ass. And it's like, I could do so many things up there. I could play like a set of like 90% feature bass or tech house and then like play my music for 10% of it and call it like a job well done, but like, it's kind of like the onus is on you to kind of, take the moral responsibility of being like, I got to represent like the kind of sonics I come from and like what I'm doing. So like, there is obviously that like dance floor rapport you have to build with them, but you have to build it within your own lexicon of like what you like and what you like to play. Otherwise it's just, there's no point.
Yeah. How'd it go at Creamfields out there?
It went well, actually. They were very, very open to everything. Like they're like moshing to like liquid drum bass at one point. I was like, what's going on?
I loved it. Have you done a lot of shows in China? I assume this was probably your biggest one.
Yeah, this is my first one.
Oh, first too. Okay.
Yeah, I've never really played there actually. Yeah, I just played an underground like rave one time in Hong Kong, but that's about it. I've never really played internationally.
Interesting. Did it feel significant or different in a way?
Oh, definitely. It was like I had no idea what to expect. I was like nervous on how they would, receive said music when the whole lineup is like Chainsmokers-esque stuff, But they reacted really well, and it was awesome.
Hey,
it was just such a huge stadium that I was like thrown off by like there were a sizable amount of people there, but because of how massive the stadium was, it looked like kind of light, but it was still like a solid crowd. Like, yeah, in a huge stadium like that, it looks like. Oh
no. Yeah. I've been there. I know exactly what you mean.
I was like, whoa.
Yeah. And I'll wrap it up here in a second, but just because we were talking about it, I had also read that you, at least sometime recently, were back living in Hong Kong for a while.
Yeah, that was during COVID. So that was kind of, I couldn't really afford to keep staying out in LA at that point because essentially when I had decided to double down on producing and just like pursuing it. The whole plan was for me to, I told my work at the time, hey, I'm going to go down to LA for a year. I really want to do this music program. If you guys want to keep me on, that'd be awesome. I'll still work. So I worked remotely at this company, and I was like juggling this job, like 2 jobs in the tech space, and then also studying at Icon, which is this like music production school.
Yeah. No, shout out to Icon. I know them. Yeah.
And yeah, after finishing up there, I was like, okay, I guess I'll go back up to the Bay and go back to work. I went up there. I was there for like 8 days total. And I remember this very clearly. I was like, hey, like, can I have this like weekend off? Can I have the Friday off for the weekend? Because I'm playing this like festival for the first time. And my boss was just like, no, absolutely not. And I was like, went to the bathroom, had a panic attack, came out, quit. Moved back down to LA, and I was like, I'm going to do this thing. And then, COVID hit.
Yeah.
And at that point I was like, I stayed in LA for another like month and a half, I think. And then I was like, okay, this is not going anywhere. I'm going to move back in with my dad and just make beats on his couch.
Sick.
So yeah, I was in Hong Kong for, I think, a year and some change before things like opened up again.
Did it feel like living there as an ostensible adult trying to like make something out of a career? Did it feel different? I don't know, in like a spiritual way, in like an adult way, in like a cultural way, to be back there as like kind of a different person?
I think it was like, absolutely. I think it was like an artistic cocoon for me in a lot of ways. Because I think first and foremost, it's almost impossible to be a touring act out of Hong Kong. It's like financially just...
Yeah.
Ecosystem wise, you can't be like a niche artist and like make it in Hong Kong. Like really, like it just really depends on the kind of medium you're working with, but especially with electronic music, no shot. Like,
yeah,
it's pretty hard. Like if I was a singer, maybe I'd have a shot. So in a lot of ways it felt removed because I was like away from everyone, but I also loved it because, I don't think I was as familiar with my own roots. Like I think in general, when you're East Asian, you grew up in America, it's so easy to assimilate and to acculturate yourself for a lot of reasons. But I think I just became very Americanized in a lot of ways. And so going back to Hong Kong, it was my first time like re-immersing myself in like a different culture and like a culture that was, mine also. And just like realizing how rich that was. Like I started watching like so much Hong Kong, like old Hong Kong films. I was seeing this girl also at the time who was like from Hong Kong, but she'd grown up in England. So she was like a version of myself that was like
that's interesting.
England,
yeah.
Like from the UK. So it was she had a very good like idea of like what it was like for me to like re-immerse myself. And so like I was watching like Infernal Affairs and like all these like old Hong Kong movies, like a bunch of like Wong Kar-wai stuff, like Fallen Angels and whatnot, and just like getting to explore Hong Kong. And like I remember being on like I was on a burial like kick, like just obsessed with burial at that point, because there's something very like, obviously he was writing this stuff inspired by like London's architecture and like London's like the environment that London was, but I feel like a lot of it worked really well with like just looking around in Hong Kong. Even acts like Lorne I was like obsessed with, and that kind of like helped me develop a lot of my sonic palette, I think. And prior to that, I feel like I was just trying to recreate. I was always just like, oh, like EPROM and Shades and G Jones are making like music I really like, and this is really sick. And Ivy Lab's making stuff I really like. This is really sick. I'm gonna try and take a little bit of inspiration here, inspiration there. But I think being out there was the first time I really like, obviously I'm still drawing from artists, but at the same time I was drawing from like my environment and like my experiences in my life for the first time. And I feel like that was so much to do with like, it was just funny. I remember like even coming back to the States, I didn't anticipate like staying. Like I was just like, oh, I got booked for the Ents. I'm going to buy a one-way ticket just to see how it works out. And
right.
If it doesn't work out, I'll like leave. But then I bought a one-way ticket to the Ents and just kept getting booked. And stayed. So.
I mean, it's not a bad way to do it. Just go with the flow, and if it works, you keep keep leaning into it, man. But I like what you're saying about kind of the idea of like finding your sound is something that comes up on here all the time. And I like what you're saying, that it's not necessarily about like making an intellectual choice about your production. It's more about like turning creativity into like a holistic practice that encompasses, you know, what's going on in your life and your background and who you are and what you think, and, you know, just kind of letting all of it flow together a little more than, you know, just, yeah, kind of what you were saying earlier, being like, well, no, I choose to make this music, you know, this sound, because that's valid, but it's less interesting, I think.
Yeah. I think a lot of artists that feel disillusioned sometimes, I think they just haven't given themselves the time to like develop that. Because I think being a touring act is very different than being a successful artist for yourself. Like, I think a lot of people, like, maybe they have the moment too early, maybe they don't have the moment at all. And both, I think, result in like some kind of disillusionment about like where your art is and where it stands. But I think if you allow yourself the space and time to like kind of come into your own palette of like out of your own volition, and not like, oh, I need to make my art profitable now. Like, if you're just creating in a bubble and being like, I'm just trying to be as creative as possible, I feel like when you find success, or commercial success specifically, later in that artistic road, there's a lot less of that imposter syndrome, or like any of the, you know, the complaints that these massively successful artists sometimes have. Like, I think that largely goes away. Like, I can't, I just can't imagine a lot of the people like I can't imagine Lauren being like dissatisfied with like the stuff he's making.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. No, it's good advice. And because the other side of that too is like, well, what if I just live in my creativity and it never happens? And like, well, yeah, that might happen also. But if you just try to make the most strategic decision at every point, even if you get to whatever you thought success was, you're not going to like it that much. Like, yeah.
You can't fully tie yourself. Like, obviously, I'm tied to external validation. Everyone is, to a certain extent. But I think it's very important to be like prescient and like choose the type of validation like that you're yearning for, to focus on. Like, sorry, I said that in such a Yoda way. It's like backwards.
The validation you seek, yeah.
But yeah, it's just like you gotta kind of have like there's this John Mayer quote that Chi put me onto, and it's like, one for them, one for me. And I think that is just such a perfect way. You know, it's an oversimplification in certain ways, but it's such a good way to like not drive yourself crazy, where it's like, okay, you know, I'm not bleeding heart artist, but simultaneously I can also like make stuff I like and stuff you like. And it's just like, this is a good medium. And yeah, I really think it works for me, especially. Like, I think, you know, Soul Ties is for me. Yeah. And then maybe a song like Shenlong is kind of for me still, but I'm like, it's for the DJs. And I think I kind of like live in that bubble where it's like, I make music for people to play out, and I make music for myself.
Yeah.
And if I pay too much attention to the third thing, which is like, I make music for my fans, then I start to get a little stir crazy. So I try to like put that on the back burner a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Well, that's a good point too. So artists get so up in arms of like, don't pigeonhole me, don't box me in. But conversely, you shouldn't do that to your fans either, right? Like, I think that's actually really smart, is not even trying to think of like, who are my fans exactly, and try to give them a definition or a shape. It's more like, you know, I think the best you can say is like, my fans are people who like my music, you know? That's pretty much.
I just think of my fans as like little versions of myself, or not little, but like maybe younger versions of myself. And I'm just like, what would I have liked back then?
Totally.
You know?
Totally. That's always a good question. Yeah, always going back to when you were a kid and the excitement and the newness. That's always smart too.
Yeah, I owe it to a younger version of myself. I always say.
Well, man, I mean, you rule, man. I really needed this chat. Is there anything we haven't talked about? Anything else you want to get out there before we wrap it up?
Not in particular. I have a London show coming up, and it's my first headline out there. I'm super excited about that. Just because I feel like, we're talking about, the kind of music I make. I feel like I love to straddle the line between US, UK.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of Hong Kong in a nutshell too, right? It's just like East meets West. And by the West, I mean, like, it's really just America and England.
Yeah, let's be honest.
In terms of like influence out there.
Yeah. When's that show?
September. So it's actually coming up. September 6th, I believe.
Oh, that's exciting, man. Have you done much international touring in general?
No, not at all. This is like my first year getting to tour elsewhere. So I'm definitely super excited. And also nervous.
No doubt, man. No, that'll be sick. I'm stoked for you, man. That'll be great. I don't really have anything else. I think we're done here, but man, I really enjoyed this, dude. This was awesome. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you for talking to me, man.
Dude, anytime. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Sweet.
Apologies if I messed up my words or for any random pauses.
Not at all. I love you for even saying that, because that's when I edit these, all I hear is me messing up sentences for hours. that's all it is.
Yeah, the first time I ever did something like this was a podcast of Brownies and Lemonade, and the whole time the guy sent me the whole interview, and I was like, why am I saying like every third word, and like
I had to let that go, man, because it's just inescapable. I forgot, that's right, you did the BNL podcast. Man, I was so stoked when they started doing that, and I was talking to Chad about it, and I understand why they couldn't keep it up, because it's a ton of work, but man, I was so stoked they were doing it.
Yeah, it was really fun also just getting to talk to Chad. Like,
he's the man. Chad is the abs. I love Chad.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah, he's the man. Who was it? Just you? Was someone else on that episode?
It was me, Valerie, and Chad. Right. Just the three of us. Yeah, it was a really good talk, honestly.
They're both. I mean, they're some of my favorites. They've both separately been on episodes of this podcast too. And yeah, I love Val, love Chad. Shout out both of them.
Yeah.
And for anyone who's listening who missed that era, go check out the Brownies and Lemonade podcast, because it was only like 6 or 12 months running, but man, they had some banger episodes. Mm-hmm. But anyway, now I'm just shouting out other podcasts, so we should probably go.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. This is awesome.
This was really great, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Super stoked we could do it. And have a great rest of your day, dude.
You too. Bye.
All right. Peace.
Peace.